On our upcoming auction, we have a beautiful and very varied collection of items carved in ivory, both Chinese and Japanese. And I'd like to focus more specifically on a very interesting group of Chinese ivory carvings, which are card cases. So we've got a collection of 4 different card cases, all carved during the course of the 19th century in China. And they're very interesting examples because China has a very long history of ivory carving. The earliest pieces we found, which were excavated in the 70s and 80s, date all the way back to the Shang dynasty, so around 1200 BC. So we know that China had been producing beautifully carved ivory pieces for the domestic market for a very long time. Now something interesting starts to happen from the late 1500s, early 1600s. We start to see very specific items that are no longer carved for the domestic market, but made for a specific export market. They're in a certain style, which is characterized by a very intricate way of ornamentation. We see that the entire surface is very intricately carved in low and high relief, and this particular type of style is known as the style of Canton. And Canton was actually a very interesting place from the late 1600s because there was a very strong presence of Europeans living in Canton at this period, which we'll see had a huge influence on the development of ivory carving for the Europeans. So already from the late 1600s, we have the French East India Company, which is installed in Canton. From the early 1700s, the British had already established several different ceramic factories. From the 1720s, we've got the Dutch VOC using Canton as a trading port. So quite naturally, from the 1730s, we start to see a development in ivory carving done by the Chinese specifically for the Europeans. And that is why these card cases are so interesting, because they belong to this specific style. So on this particular piece, we have a very chinoiserie iconography that we often see on literati or scholars' objects, where we have different figural groups placed very delicately. We see that the composition has been beautifully balanced, and they're placed before pavilions. We see the usual trees and flowers, which are very symbolic to the Chinese. We have the pine, which is symbolic of longevity. We have the plum blossom, which often means renewal. And so this is just a very typical literati-themed card case, as opposed to another example which we can look closer at, which is actually really interesting because the iconography is no longer Oriental, but it's focusing on very European themes. So, for example, we've got the representation of Napoleon's house on the front and Napoleon's tomb on the reverse. Oriental figural groups have now been replaced by representations of Europeans having tea and wearing hats. So there's been a definite shift and transition in the iconography. It's also important to note that in Canton there wasn't purely production of ivory carving happening for the export market, but also for the domestic market at the same time.